The rope had been knotted by a man who knew his work. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Clean bowline below the ear. The slack measured with the practiced indifference of a man who'd done this before and would do it again. The deputy who tied it had brown hands and never looked at the face of the man whose neck would receive it. That was a skill too, perhaps, the ability to not look. El Paso on a Wednesday morning in late October of 1883 smelled like dust and river rot and the smoke from 3 breakfast fires along San Antonio Street. The crowd had gathered early, not because they loved a hanging exactly, but because they had nothing else pressing at that hour, and the town had been talking about this particular hanging for 3 weeks. Cade Ortega, accused of the murder of one Harlan Brannock, merchant, dry goods, a man with a wife and 2 daughters and a reputation for fair weights on the scale. The man at the edge of the crowd had arrived sometime after dawn. He stood apart from the others, nearer to the far side of the square where the morning shadow of the feed store still touched the ground. He wore a coat that had seen considerable weather. His hat brim was low. He watched with the stillness of someone who was not there for the spectacle. He watched like a man taking an account of something. Cade Ortega was 26 years old. He walked up the scaffold steps without being dragged. That counted for something. His hands were bound, but his shoulders were square, and he looked out at the crowd with a face that had already gone somewhere else, somewhere quiet. His lips moved briefly, a prayer maybe, or a name, and then stopped. The man at the edge of the crowd had been in the cantina on Overland Street the night Harlan Brannock was killed. He had been sitting in the back corner with a glass of mezcal he mostly didn't drink, watching the room the way he always watched rooms. Cade Ortega had been there too, playing Monty with 3 other men until well past midnight, laughing once, loudly, at something the dealer said. Cade Ortega had not left that cantina before 2 in the morning. Harlan Brannock had died before midnight. The man at the edge of the crowd knew this. He had known it from the day they arrested Ortega. He had sat with that knowledge the way you sit with a stone in your boot, aware of it at every step, deciding whether to stop and deal with it or push on. He had pushed on. He had stayed in El Paso longer than he intended, watching the trial from a distance, waiting to see if the truth would surface on its own. It did not surface. The witnesses the prosecution produced had seen something, or said they had. The defense lawyer was a young man from Missouri who sweated through his collar in the October heat and could not shake what had been built against his client. The trap opened. The rope went taut. Cade Ortega was dead before the echo of it left the square. The crowd dispersed the way crowds do. Slowly at first, then all at once. People turning back to their days as if what had just happened was simply a chore crossed off a list. The man at the edge of the crowd watched until the body stopped moving. He watched a long time after that. Then he turned and walked back to the livery on El Paso Street, saddled his horse, and rode south out of town without speaking to anyone. That afternoon, El Paso forgot he had ever been there. It would take 6 days for him to come back. Nobody saw him during those 6 days. There were people later who claimed they did. A man matching his description seen in a cantina in Juarez. A rider spotted on the Camino Real heading toward Chihuahua City. But accounts like that accumulate around a man like sediment, and most of them are wrong. What can be said with some confidence is this. He moved deliberately. He did not wander. The first 2 days he rode south into Chihuahua. There was a man there named Esteban Delgado, who had run cattle in the Mesilla Valley for years before a drought and a bad year drove him to smaller operations further south. Delgado had known the Ortega family since Cade was a boy. He had also, at some point in the preceding year, come to know certain things about the land transactions happening along the east bank of the Rio Grande. Transactions involving a man named Arvin Pratt, who worked as an agent for a land syndicate based out of St. Louis. The stranger found Delgado at a ranch outside the town of Aldama, 3 hours south of Chihuahua City. The meeting was not long. The stranger had a quality some men have and most men don't, the ability to communicate that he was serious without making a show of it. Delgado was a careful man, but he was also a man who had watched Cade Ortega grow up and had heard about what happened in El Paso, and that knowledge sat in him like a wound that wasn't healing. He told what he knew. He named a name and described a transaction. He drew a rough map of where certain documents had been recorded and under what names. The stranger listened. He did not write anything down, at least not in front of Delgado. He thanked the man with a nod and rode north. Days 3 and 4 took him east, toward Laredo. There had been 2 witnesses in the Brannock case, men who had claimed to see Ortega near the merchant's warehouse the night of the killing. The defense had noted, quietly and without much effect, that both men had left El Paso within days of testifying and could not be located for cross-examination. Courts moved slowly, and by the time the absence of those witnesses might have mattered, Ortega was already dead. The stranger found them in Laredo. They were not together. He found the first one, a man named Cass, working the loading docks along the river. He found the second, a younger man called Whitlow, in a boarding house near the rail yard. He did not threaten either of them. He asked questions in the quiet way he asked questions, and the answers came. Men talk when they believe the man listening already knows most of it, and sometimes they are right. What he learned confirmed what Delgado had suggested. Arvin Pratt had paid both men, not lavishly, but enough. Harlan Brannock had stood in the way of a land acquisition Pratt needed to complete. The dispute had been financial at its root, as such disputes usually are. Pratt had hired the matter handled. Cade Ortega had been an available name, a young man with a minor record, known to have argued with Brannock over a debt 6 months prior. Convenient. The kind of convenient that only happens when someone is arranging it. Days 5 and 6 the stranger spent in careful motion. He located the land office records in a county seat that shall remain unspecified. He knew enough about such offices to know where things were kept and how to read what he found. He was thorough. He was patient. He did not hurry. By the morning of the 7th day, he was riding back toward El Paso. He had everything. He crossed back into Texas as the sun cleared the mountains to the east, and the desert light turned the whole landscape the color of old brass. He rode at a steady pace. The horse knew the way. The man on its back said nothing, thought whatever he thought, and watched the ground ahead. El Paso appeared in the distance like something that had been waiting. If you want to see where this goes, hit subscribe before the marshal finds out what this man brought back with him. You will not want to miss what happens next. Rosario Mendez had lived on Calle Segunda since 1879. She was 33 years old in 1883, which in El Paso at that time made her neither young nor old. She had dark hair that she wore pinned at the back of her neck, and she had eyes that noticed things other people's eyes skipped past. She ran the small household that had been her mother's and took in sewing work and knew most of what happened on her street before it finished happening. She had seen the stranger before. In 1881, he had passed through El Paso briefly. She could not have said exactly when, sometime in the late spring, when the heat was climbing but hadn't yet arrived at its full cruelty. He had helped her without being asked. She had been carrying a cedar chest across the threshold of the house. It had belonged to her grandmother, and it was heavier than it looked. He had been walking past on the street, and had simply stepped up and taken one end without speaking, and together they had moved it inside. He had set it down where she indicated. She had turned to thank him, and he was already headed back toward the door. She had touched his arm, just briefly, the way you touch a stranger's arm when you need them to pause a moment so you can say thank you and mean it. He had looked at her, just for a moment. Something passed across his face that she couldn't name then, and still couldn't name years later when she thought about it. He had nodded, and then he had gone. She had asked about him later. In the cantina on Overland Street, someone had said the name Tucker, half-whispered, the way people whispered names they weren't sure they should be saying. She had filed that name away without knowing exactly why. Now it was the 7th day, and she was standing in the doorway of her house on Calle Segunda, watching the street, when she saw him ride in from the south end of town. She recognized him immediately. She couldn't have explained how. The coat was different, the horse was different. But there are people you recognize in the body before the mind catches up, and he was one of those. She watched him come up the street at a slow walk. The horse's hooves were quiet on the packed earth. He was passing her house when she said it, not loudly, just a name, spoken at a normal volume into the morning air. Tucker. He did not stop, but he paused. It was different from stopping, a barely perceptible hesitation in his movement, like a clock skipping a fraction of a tick. His head did not turn. His hands on the reins did not change, but he had heard it. She was certain of that. He continued walking the horse up the street. She stood in the doorway and watched him go. The dust his horse raised settled slowly in the still air. She stayed there long after he turned the corner and disappeared. She did not say the name again. Arvin Pratt kept an office on the 2nd floor of a building on El Paso Street, above a dry goods establishment that was not, in fact, the establishment once run by Harlan Brannock, though the irony of the proximity was not lost on those few who thought about such things. Pratt was 51 years old, and had spent 20 years cultivating the kind of respectability that takes careful, sustained effort to build, and can be demolished in an afternoon. The stranger did not go to Pratt's office. He went instead to the hotel on San Francisco Street, where he had heard that a circuit judge named Holloway was staying for 2 nights before continuing his route north. Judge Holloway was a small, precise man from San Antonio who had a reputation for taking evidence seriously and for having a low tolerance for the kind of arrangements that left innocent men dead. He had been on the bench long enough to have seen most of what men did to each other, and very little surprised him anymore. The stranger knocked on the door of room 7. Holloway opened it himself. He looked at the man in front of him for a moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. They were inside for just over an hour. What passed between them in that room was not witnessed, but the nature of it can be inferred from what happened next. The stranger had laid out what he'd gathered: the financial records from the land transactions, the documented testimony of Delgado regarding what Pratt had said and done, the accounts of Cass and Whitlow regarding the payment they had received to provide testimony. He had organized it in a way that was clear, sequential, and difficult to dispute. He presented it without theatrics. He was not asking for anything. He was delivering something. Holloway was quiet for a long time after the presentation concluded. Then he asked 3 questions. The stranger answered each of them. Holloway nodded once, slowly, and reached for his pen. By mid-morning, Arvin Pratt had been placed under arrest by the El Paso marshal, the same marshal who had presided over the execution of Cade Ortega 3 weeks prior. The marshal's name was Beaumont. He was a compact man with a gray mustache and the general bearing of someone accustomed to being the most certain person in any room. He sat in his office afterward with his hands flat on his knees, staring at the middle distance, and when 2 separate people asked him what he thought about the turn of events, he said nothing that anyone found useful. Justice, when it finally arrived quietly and without ceremony, as it often does. Pratt was held. The syndicate he worked for would spend the next 2 years trying to extract itself from the legal consequences. Some of them would succeed, some would not. That part of the story belongs to a different account. The stranger was not in El Paso when Pratt was taken into custody. He had already moved on to the next thing. The Ortega family lived in a small house a quarter-mile east of town, on land that Cade Ortega's father had worked for 30 years before his death. Cade's mother, Esperanza, was 71 years old. She had a face that had been shaped by weather and work and grief in equal measure. She had buried a husband, raised 4 children, and 2 weeks ago she had watched her youngest son hang in the public square for something she knew in her bones he had not done. The stranger arrived at her door in the early afternoon. He knocked. She opened the door herself. She looked at him without speaking. He removed his hat. He told her what he had found. Not everything. There were details that served no purpose except to wound further, and he left those out. He told her the essential truth, that her son had been convicted on manufactured evidence, that the man who arranged it had been identified and was now in the custody of the law, that witnesses had confirmed what she had always believed. He spoke plainly. He did not soften it in the ways people sometimes soften things to make themselves feel better about the delivery. She did not cry, at least not while he was there. She listened. She nodded in certain places. Once she closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, something in her face had shifted. Not into relief exactly, but into something adjacent to it. The relief of being right when you needed to be right, even when being right gave you nothing back. He stayed for 20 minutes. At the end of it, she offered him coffee, and he declined, gently. She thanked him, and he acknowledged it with a slight inclination of his head, the same way he acknowledged most things people said to him that required acknowledgement but not words. He put his hat back on. He walked to his horse, which was tied at the post near the road. He mounted. He sat for a moment looking south, toward the border, toward the desert opening up in that direction, toward the mountains in the far distance that belonged to Mexico. He rode south. He did not look back at the house. He did not need to. Some debts cannot be paid. That is not a reason to stop trying to pay them. It is simply a fact that sits alongside the effort, neither canceling it nor diminishing it. Cade Ortega was 26 years old and he was dead, and no amount of correct information delivered to a circuit judge would change that. The stranger knew this. He had known it from the moment the rope went taut in the El Paso square. He had gone anyway, done what could be done, found what could be found, delivered what could be delivered. That was the work, not the satisfaction of it, just the work itself. Calle Segunda was quiet in the middle of the afternoon. The heat had pressed most people indoors, and the street had that particular midday stillness that El Paso wore in the warmer months. The dust settled, the air barely moving, the sound of the town reduced to its minimum. A dog somewhere in the distance, the distant clang of a smithy. Rosario was in her doorway again. She had not planned to be there. She had been inside, working on a hem, when something made her set down her needle and walk to the door. She would not have been able to explain what that something was. She stood in the frame of the door with one hand resting on the wood, looking down the street. He came from the north end this time, heading south. The same horse, the same slow walk. The coat still on despite the heat, as if he had made some arrangement with the temperature that the rest of the world was not privy to. She watched him come. She said the name again when he was close enough to hear it. Tucker. He did not stop. He did not pause this time, not even that fraction of a tick hesitation. He rode past her doorway with the same steady pace, looking forward, his face in the shadow of his hat brim. Just for a moment, and she would think about this later, in the evening, with her sewing in her lap and the lamp burning low. Just for a moment, as he passed, she thought she saw his jaw tighten, not in anger, in something harder to name. And then he was past her house, and the street stretched behind him, and she was watching his back recede toward the south end of Calle Segunda, toward the road that led to the river, toward the border, toward the desert that opened up on the other side of everything. She watched until he was gone. She stayed in the doorway a little longer after that, her hand on the wood, looking at the empty street. Then she went back inside. The desert south of El Paso does not care what you carry into it. It receives men and their histories with the same indifference it receives rain and wind and the long, slow erosion of stone. It does not ask where you have been, or what you have done, or whether what you did was enough. It simply extends itself in every direction and waits, as it has always waited, for whatever comes next. He rode south through that afternoon and into the early evening, when the desert light shifted from brass to copper to the deep flat violet that precedes full dark. The mountains to the west held the last of the sun long after the flats had gone to shadow. The air cooled with the abruptness that only desert air achieves, warm to cold in 20 minutes, as if the day had simply made a decision. He did not make camp. He kept riding. 6 days. A dead man whose name would now be attached to something other than shame. A mother who had received a truth that cost her nothing more than what she had already lost. An old debtor in Chihuahua who had unburdened himself of something he'd been carrying. 2 men in Laredo who would spend the rest of their lives knowing that what they'd done had eventually surfaced. A circuit judge with new evidence and the inclination to use it. A land agent sitting in a cell in El Paso, facing the particular consequences that tend to follow when careful arrangements come carefully apart. And Rosario in her doorway on Calle Segunda, saying a name into the afternoon air. He arrived too late to stop the hanging. He knew that from the moment he understood what he was riding back toward. Too late to save Kate Ortega. Not too late to mean something to Esperanza Ortega, 71 years old, who had needed someone to sit across from her and confirm what she already knew in her blood. Not too late to ensure that Arvin Pratt faced what he had constructed, rather than living comfortably in the architecture of it. There are men who will not act unless the outcome justifies the effort. He was not one of those men. The desert opened ahead of him in the darkness, vast and without judgment, and he rode into it without hesitation, the horse's hooves finding the ground in the dark with the quiet confidence of long practice. The stars coming out one by one above the flats like witnesses to something that required no audience. He would not be in El Paso in the morning. He would not be in the next town either, not in any way that could be confirmed. But somewhere, in some direction, he was moving. Doing the arithmetic of wrong things and late arrivals and what it costs to act when the reward is nothing but the action itself. Carrying whatever it is such men carry. Riding until the next thing presented itself, which it always did. It always did. What story do you want to see him ride into next? Drop it in the comments below. Every story you name is a road he might take.